moment is here, you can stop your search. It's Comics by Perch.
Hey everybody, this is Perch. Got a great viewer question here because it's a complex one. It requires a lot of nuance. It requires a lot of kind of theory and thought, and I'm excited to kind of get into this one. So let me read. It says, "Hey Perch, I wanted to reach out and say hello. I've worked in comics for over 30 years as a writer-editor. Did some coloring early on until I learned better. Been listening to your channel for several months now. I find your content to be very engaging." Thank you for that. I appreciate it. I'm always glad people show up and want to listen to this stuff. It's very nice. It was great seeing your interview with Greenberg. By the way, this is one of, I think, my favorite interviews. We've talked to a lot of great people, and I will continue to interview a lot of people. I want a lot of people from all over. I especially am looking for people who don't have a million interviews already up. So I'll give you an example. A lot of people have been pointing to me and saying, can you interview Chuck Dixon? I'd love to. I think Dixon wrote a lot of comics that are very interesting. I think he's got some interesting stories to tell. In particular, I'd like to talk to Dixon about really kind of the mechanics of writing those comics back then, as opposed to current events. And the reason being, not because I want to shy away from current events, but because there's dozens of interviews, literally dozens of interviews, including his own channel, his own stuff, where he talks about that. So I don't want to cover the same ground. When I do interviews, I try and get to either people that really haven't had a lot of material out there, and by material I mean interviews, or ask them at least questions that haven't been asked before. I want to try and get to some different material. I have an interview coming up with Ron Mars that I think is really interesting. Got a lot of things to say. But a lot of people will come in and they kind of want to dictate the interview. Like, you should talk to this person, you shouldn't talk to this person. Somebody sent me a completely, I realize I'm getting off track with this, man. I promise I'll get back to it. But it actually fits this question that you're about to ask. I had somebody send me a list of people that I should not interview. And because it would be an insult to the listeners, and included people like Vita Ayala and Mags and others. And there's Dan Slott was on that list. Mark Wade was on that list. There's a bunch of people like that. And I found it such an obnoxious mail. Like, first of all, you don't tell somebody else what you can and can't do. That's ridiculous. But also, how stupid is that? Don't you want to hear different voices? You want to hear other people's perspectives. It's interesting. Just because an interview goes out and you listen to it, you don't have to agree with it. I personally like listening to different perspectives, including ones I know I'm not going to agree with. It helps me become a better person generally. But I just find that very, very odd. Anyway, Glenn Greenberg, on the other hand, is an excellent interview, gives a lot of insight into what it was like working in editorial in Marvel, and is incredible. It's in the interviews. There's a playlist with just the interviews. You can stop listening to my silly crap and actually go listen to some of these interviews. There's there's amazing ones in there. Bill Loebs is another one that's just an incredible interview. But there's tons. There's tons of really great discussions to be had, but Glenn Greenberg is not a name everybody knows. It's definitely worth a listen. They all are, very frankly. Anyway, sorry, back to the mail. Went off track. I often ruminate on the state of the industry, or even if there's an industry left. I'd like to suggest a topic of discussion, if I may be so bold. The splitting of the fandom, and how healthy is it? We've seen it at the big two. The most prominent example of fandom splitting was DC's Crisis on Infinite Earths reboot, which split the pre-crisis from the post-crisis back in 1985. As you know, pre-crisis fans couldn't accept 50 years of continuity being tossed to the wind, while post-crisis fans wanted a new take on old characters, and ironically, in some cases, new takes were just old takes. The New 52 splintered the fans even further. I almost want to stop and read that again, but you can just go back. That's a really powerful observation, absolutely correct observation. And he goes on. At Marvel, you had Spider-Man's marriage to Mary Jane. I was never a fan of their marriage because it seemed to come out of nowhere and didn't seem to be in character for either of them. Later, we learned it was because Marvel felt they had to marry them in the comics because Stan had done so in the nationally syndicated comic strip. To fans like me, it wasn't fair to take a character who'd been single for 25 years and then suddenly have them be married. It just wasn't the Spider-Man we'd grown up with, and it greatly changed the comic's dynamic. That's when I stopped reading the comic as a fan. That's an interesting statement, because we often hear, and we'll go into it in a second, about One More Day and kind of the reversal of the marriage, the undoing of the marriage. But what he's identifying here is correct. It was jarring for a lot of fans because the marriage, I think, once the characters were married, I think there was a lot of really good organic storytelling about their relationship. I think that it was pretty powerful. I think the writers did a good job of kind of filling in the blanks as it went on. But it did come kind of suddenly in the comics. And I do remember that fans were like, wait, what? We missed the build. And I would argue that maybe some of what goes on here when you have these moments is when you act abruptly, it splits people, it polarizes people. Maybe Spider-Man's marriage getting dissolved in One More Day, if it had been built up in a kind of meaningful way. But Mephisto kind of just appeared on the scene, just somewhat out of nowhere. I mean, it wasn't built. And maybe if it's sudden, that causes more of the damage. I don't know. I'm speculating here, but we go on. When I worked at Marvel in the 90s, you wouldn't believe the amount of brain cells lost as editorial schemed to find ways to undo the marriage because they felt it had damaged Spider-Man's character. Then finally, One More Day, Brand New Day came along and split the fandom. I can name other examples, Barry Allen and Wally West, Kyle Rayner and Hal Jordan, and to be fair, DC does seem more guilty of it than Marvel. So it's fair to say company-wide reboots are definitely fandom splitters. One could argue that older fans don't like change, but every time fandom is split, the change is typically sudden and inorganic. Absolutely. I'm curious to know your thoughts, and if you run this, So, thank you very much. The writer preferred to remain anonymous, and that's completely fine, absolutely fine. I generally take that policy with everything anyway. But man, what a great topic. Unfortunately, this is a topic where like you'd want to do it on a live stream with a bunch of guests or an interview with other people. You'll get my stupid opinion on it, but I want to take this and run with it with some other people as well because I think it's absolutely it's clever. It's a good observation. Absolutely, this is a problem. I think you hit the nail on the head and kind of what I was saying earlier. When it's sudden, and it often is sudden, and it feels, it feels to the readers, to the fans, to the customers, it feels like it's coming out of nowhere. It feels like somebody wasn't planning, somebody wasn't doing a good job of putting everything together. And then all of a sudden it's like, all right, we're going to make these changes. And just it comes across as very abrupt. And I think the entire nature of comics, and in particular, if the monthly comics are to survive, then the goal is that you've got serialized storytelling, much like wrestling, much like TV shows, much like soap operas, that kind of thing. You have these stories that build over time. And so the promise, maybe the implicit promise you're making with the reader, is that you're going to slowly build things. I think the reason why a lot of comic readers love Claremont's era so much is because it encapsulated this idea of long-form storytelling. You had subplots that wouldn't get paid off for years in some cases. And but everything seemed to move at this constant, steady pace. And whenever things got jarring, whenever there was an abrupt change, it felt unnatural. It felt, like you said, inorganic to the character, and the readers would tend to revolt. But a lot of these changes, I mean, in the interview with Martha Thomas's, talked about how, you had the death of Superman come up, and it was this kind of last second planned event. Now, it did very well, but it was jarring. You had, I remember her comment, which, just stunned Joe and I, that, DC had two things to promote. The fact that Robin got a slightly newer costume, a new costume design, and the fact that, Clark Kent and Lois Lane were getting married. And in DC's mind, Robin's new costume was the important story. That was the big one. And so I think what you see is that these changes, they feel either not thought through, or maybe put a better way, they're understood. They're not. The people who are in charge making these decisions undervalue the impact of those decisions. And so I think they get more casual and more cavalier about, like, let's just make massive change. And we have crisis and we're just going to do this. And this is going to be important. People are wanting this and people want new fans. But it does split the fandom. And I think when it splits the fandom, you lose fans. I think that you get people who emotionally disconnect. I also think there's a bit of a trap there because you don't see immediate sales loss. I think and I would question at times if people in the business are even paying attention to the sales. I think I've talked to other editors who do not know the sales numbers for their books, and I'm always like, oh my God, I don't know how you're even doing your job, but good on you, I guess. The sales impact of these major changes, of these abrupt changes, are not immediately noticeable. They tend to come slowly. They tend to be, over time, the kind of reveal how these things are shifting. And as such, I think a lot of people in management, they don't understand the consequence of what they've done. Fans who are unhappy with changes tend to keep buying the comics for a little while and then just trickle away. The thing to look for, and it's very hard, is are you emotionally disconnecting people from comics? Comics works if you're doing monthly, stories. It works when you have people very emotionally tied in and connected to the books. The second you break that, you break part of your business model. You may still get sales, but you're not getting this emotional connected sales. What you really want is a customer who's going to come in and say, I don't care what they're doing in X-Men. I can't live without having every issue of the X-Men. So just sign me up, put me on my poll box. I will buy it, and I will accept the fact that it may go 5-6 years with a run I don't like, but then I have faith that it's going to get back there someday. I'm emotionally connected to this comic. I can't let it go. That's what you want as a business, because financially that's good for you. But if you break that, then things fall apart pretty quickly. And I think these fandom splitting events like you've identified do that. And I think increasingly in the desire to get short-term cash, you're seeing more and more of these things break. You're seeing more and more hot-shotting. I think you see it with reboots. You see it with retcons. You see it with events. You see it with renumbering. All of these things, they start to bifurcate the fans, the customers. And the more you do that, the fewer there are. Every time you're just eroding constantly. And I think the problem is the only reason you do that is because you are bringing new fans in. But right now, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that new fans aren't coming in. They're not interested in this product. And quite frankly, it's really hard to get people emotionally invested into this kind of storytelling, particularly when the whole world has moved to, get it all at once kind of content that you see on Netflix and other things. It's why the graphic novels are doing well. It's one of the reasons why manga has an advantage, because in many cases, the books are, years in. Like if you jump onto One Piece, you can read for years before you finally, quote unquote, catch up. So you can have it as fast as you want it. Same thing with a lot of these books that are out right now. Demon Slayer, My Hero Academia, others that are dominating charts. Chainsaw Man. There's a lot of content built up, so you can consume it quick. But the business of putting something out every month in this long-form storytelling, it's a great business as long as you respect the fact that you can't split the fans and also acknowledge that it's going to take you a long time to get those fans. And when you get them, you got to protect that business. But anyway, these are some initial thoughts. I will grab a panel of people together to talk more about this because I think it's an absolutely fascinating topic. Thank you for sending it my way. Really appreciate it. Thanks for listening. And let me know your thoughts in the comments below, all of you. And thanks for listening.